It is my absolute honor today to be interviewing one of the top scholars in the country. Dr. Yuval Levin is the author of one of my favorite books, The Great Debate. You can see it behind me right here, but I want to go through his resume because we are so privileged to have him with us today. He's the editor of the National Affairs publication. He's a top scholar at the American Enterprise Institute. That's a think tank in D.C. He's worked in the White House for several years. He's been featured in multiple top programs and publications as well. So we are absolutely thrilled to be having him with us today. So Dr. Levin, thank you so much for your time and welcome to the program.
Thanks very much for having me. I'm glad to do it.
Yeah, so I want to jump straight into it. I know you've written several books. Really the one that we enjoy the most and that we're actually looking into for our book club is The Great Debate, and especially because you mentioned Edmund Burke in that, you trace conservatism back to him, and that speaks to us because that's really what our channel is about, is trying to expand upon his thought and kind of determine what that means for us today and how we can use it. But let me ask you first, as you got into that book and you researched Edmund Burke and Thomas Paine, what inspired you to do that?
Well, I think Burke and Paine offer a wonderful way to think about some of the underlying issues that define what we think of as the left-right debate. The politics of our society and of a lot of free societies tend to break down into roughly two broad groups, not always two parties, but sort of two sets of views that end up being about how to think about the past and the future, how to think about change in society. They're both, broadly speaking, liberal views in the sense that they believe in the free society, they believe in elections, they believe in freedom of religion and a few other important principles of our society, human equality above all. But they differ about how social change happens and about whether ultimately what society ought to be focused on is preserving the best or overthrowing the past and advancing toward a completely different kind of state. And that difference, which is so prominent in so many debates, can be traced back to the arguments around the time of the French Revolution. And in some ways, Burke and Paine had the clearest debate around that question. They engaged each other. They took up the one another's strongest arguments, not weakest arguments. And their exchanges form a kind of debate that you can really look at as one of the origins of the left-right divide.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely fascinating. And I think a lot of people are really unaware that debate is really, has even happened or is continue to happen along those lines. I mean, when you think of Thomas Paine, I think most people are going to go to common sense and what he wrote during the American Revolution, how he galvanized society, or at least a large portion of it to support that revolution. I mean, I think of Glenn Beck using that same title for some of his work within the conservative movement. And yet in the work, you talk about how there's an inherent worldview in what Paine wrote. You talk about his Enlightenment views. You talk about references to Newtonian science, progressivism, individualism in his writing. Can you explain more of what that worldview is that Thomas Paine had and how that's evident in his work?
Yeah, Paine is known to us Americans, of course, above all, for the important role that he played in the American Revolution, which was a very important role and a very constructive role in trying to persuade the public and American elites that the cause of independence was just. Common Sense may be best known, or the Crisis Papers, which were all ways of making that argument to the public. What's less known about Paine, at least here, is that he then, about 10 years later, went to France and was involved at every stage of the French Revolution as a kind of defender of the revolution to the English-speaking world. He was in Paris for most of the time of the revolution, and he wrote essays arguing in favor of what the French were doing. Now, the French Revolution and the American Revolution have a lot in common, but they also differ in some very fundamental ways. The American Revolution really contained within it what we now would think of as both a left and a right. If you think of Thomas Jefferson and John Adams working together in the committee that wrote the Declaration of Independence, Jefferson and Adams later, of course, divided bitterly over lines that we now would recognize as left-right lines. And there were arguments for American independence that were quite radical and quite revolutionary in the French sense. They wanted to overthrow the past and start over on new principles. There were other arguments for the American Revolution that were more conservative, that said we have long had this system of government, this degree of self-government in the colonies. We're being denied it now, and we want our rights back. The Declaration of Independence itself contains both of those elements of the argument: the principles at the beginning, the essential core ideals, and then arguments afterwards about what the king had done that are much more prudential and much more about maintaining the independence, the self-government of the colonies. And so Paine was very much on the former side, on the side that said this is about fundamental principles. The arguments of common sense, they're arguments against monarchy, not just against what the king had done to the colonies, but really against the rule of the king in Britain. Most of the arguments of the American Revolution didn't go nearly that far. But Paine's arguments, especially as you see them around France, end up being quite radical. And he really does suggest that the ideals of equality and liberty, properly understood, actually demand a total revolution, a break with the past. And that question of whether what's needed is a break or a gradual improvement ends up being the question between the left and the right, or at least between Burke and Paine.
Yeah, man, I think that's absolutely fascinating when you talk about radicalism as associated with someone who is so important to the American founding. I think in the book you mentioned that Paine was against many of the checks and balances and federalism, and potentially might have even opposed the Constitution, or at least some of its thought. And to me, that speaks to a diversity within the American founders that often gets overlooked. On this show, we try to have, as often as we can, liberals and moderates and libertarians, and try to recreate some of that diversity in how we talk to each other. When you think about the fact that the founders worked together and in spite of those differences, were able to accomplish what they did, do you see that type of bipartisanship today, or is that largely lost?
Well, in some ways, the moment of the American founding was a very unusual moment in our political debates, obviously. And one way in which that happened was that there was, as I say, this kind of left and right within the framework of the founders who had joined together. There was obviously also a political division. There were loyalists who opposed American independence, but within the camp of independence, there were people who were quite radical. In some ways, Thomas Jefferson was, certainly Tom Paine was, and there were people who were fairly conservative, like John Adams, and ultimately like the Federalists ended up being. What you find in Paine's arguments around this question is that he believed in a fairly absolute form of democracy. He didn't think that there should be separation of powers, that there needed to be checks and balances on the public will. As you say, he basically opposed the bicameral legislature, had a lot of problems with the complexity of the constitutional system, whereas someone like Burke, or in our case like John Adams, in some ways like Alexander Hamilton, had a darker view of human nature, a sense that people needed more guidance and more formation, and therefore institutions needed to be somewhat more complicated. I think there are certainly ways of compromising from between those camps, and our politics for much of American history has consisted of compromises between people whose views are more radical and people whose views are more modest and conservative. We have lost some of that knack for compromise in our own time. I think there's no way around that. It still happens, of course, and we see it maybe especially around moments of crisis, like the public health crisis that we've been living through. It is still now and then possible for Congress to come up with compromises. But I think we've reached a point in our politics now when each party seems to think that the other party is the country's biggest problem. And that makes it very difficult for our system to function. I think going back to the origins of the debates, looking at Burke and Paine, looking at the founding era, can help us to understand that, yes, what we've got here are two worldviews, but they have an enormous amount in common, and ultimately our society is held in balance when they can negotiate and compromise with one another, and we certainly need to recapture that spirit in our own time.
Yeah, I totally agree. I want to look at some comments from our followers, because we've been having this discussion really all week, and we look at, I deal with all the time is comments on our page or thoughts in the media where we seem to stereotype and we seem to kind of lambast the entire American left, or you see liberals doing it with the entire American right, and kind of, seem to imply that they're monolithic, and yet the people that
Yeah.
we have on this page don't really always fit into. We have one of our guests frequently, his name is Christopher, and he doesn't support, he's a left, Democrat, but he doesn't support Bernie Sanders. He thinks that's too radical. So as we get into this diversity of thought for both the right and the left, I'm curious to hear your thoughts. So one of our questions comes from Sean, and he said he wanted me to ask you to hypothesize the following. If Tom Paine were alive today, what would he think of progressive politics? Would he view as a logical outgrowth, what's happening today in terms of the Enlightenment Jacobin thought, or something wholly other? And I think what Sean is getting at is when you think about the fact that, we had an avowed socialist running for president, Bernie Sanders, you've got that in Congresswoman AOC, you have increasingly streams of thought that are pretty far left. Do you still see that as traced back to Thomas Paine, or do you see that as something wholly different?
Yeah. Well, I'll tell you, I think at the foundation of the difference between left and right, very broadly understood as it emerges from Burke and Paine and others, is a difference about human nature, is a difference over the question of whether the human person is born free and ready to be free, but is oppressed by various kinds of institutions in our society, or whether the human person is born fallen and imperfect and in need of formation by the institutions of our society. I think that is still very much a left-right difference. It leads us to a difference between people who think that we should begin from gratitude for what works and try to build on that, and people who think we should begin from outrage at what is unjust and broken and try to start over. It's important to see that there is justice in both of these views, but they are quite different from each other. And I do think that today's left is recognizably left. It is rooted in some of the assumptions that Paine would certainly have recognized, and you can see in some of his own thinking, especially around the French Revolution, an openness to radicalism, even an openness to a certain amount of suppression of thought and expression. But I think that Paine was absolutely committed at the end of the day to the principles of the democratic society, and I think he would have had problems with the kind of with the kind of political correctness and suppression of thought that we do find sometimes in the contemporary left. So, I think of Paine more as a progressive liberal, and today's progressivism is increasingly illiberal.
That's fascinating. I mean, I think of we're talking about how few probably liberals think of Thomas Paine in this light, but the same could be said for conservatives. I mean, how often do you actually hear conservatives outside of academia and the intellectual spheres referencing Edmund Burke? I was so thrilled in the Supreme Court decision, even though I didn't really agree with the outcome that happened this past week, when you had Justice Clarence Thomas and Justice Roberts actually referencing Edmund Burke. I was like, yes, like he's alive. People are still referencing him, but you don't see that very often in the news cycle on Fox or what have you, and you talk about that in the book. Is you talk about how there are certainly some differences with conservatives and Edmund Burke's thought, and yet a lot of times they get to that place where they're defending institutions and tradition and things like that the same way that he did. Can you talk about Burke's worldview as well, and how you see that? You talk about his notion of prescription and justice by experience. Can you kind of explain that for some folks here that may not be as familiar?
Yeah, Burke really does begin from the premise that human beings as individuals are born broken and imperfect. He thinks that what we need from our society is some formation that could allow us to be free, that's what our institutions provide, starting with the family and the community and religion, civil society, and all the way working through the economy and politics as well. And he's therefore a defender of functional institutions. He's more impressed by what works than he is outraged by what fails, because his expectations are low. And look, if you'd grown up in Ireland in the 1740s, your expectations would be pretty low. That's broken society. And Burke thought it is much easier to imagine our institutions falling into disrepair and chaos than to imagine that we're on the verge of utopia. And so he was always more worried about breaking things down than he was eager to start fresh and start from scratch. And he thought we had the resources to build on what we have to improve our society gradually. And so Burke is an incrementalist. He is a traditionalist. And not because he doesn't want change, but because he thinks change happens by gradual improvement over time. It's a kind of evolutionary theory before Darwin, in a way. He thinks we try things, most fail, some succeed, we keep the ones that work, and that's how change happens. So that if you break that continuity and have a revolution that throws away your history, then you've lost the capacity to improve. You've lost the ability to build on what you had. And of course, that's very recognizable as a conservative worldview. I would say Burke is not a populist. Burke doesn't think that the public has all the answers, just as he doesn't think that elites have all the answers. Burke, like many of the American founders, and I think like the logic of our Constitution, doesn't think anybody has all the answers, and thinks we need to build institutions around the fact that we don't know everything. And so we need checks and balances. We need ways to slow down change so that we can make sure it's what we want. At the same time, that we need to make sure that no group of technocrats is governing us from above and telling us what to do. So I think in that sense, Burke is a recognizable worldview for a lot of American conservatives. But our conservatism, at least in this moment, tends to be a little more populist, a little more confident that the people have all the answers, and at the same time also, I think, more resentful of elites than Burke was. It seems to me we go too far in that direction. We have a lot to learn from Burke, but different times are different, and different moments require different kinds of worldviews.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, when you say that, it makes me think of him talking about reformation and trying to reform institutions instead of just discarding them. Hence his disagreements with the French Revolution. And I think of the monuments and the statues and how that we're talking about Columbus Day. One of the things we do on this channel is we're about to take a few episodes of our weekly show and really look at who Christopher Columbus was and try to have kind of a thoughtful approach to this. Do we need to discard that holiday? Well, let's not do that in a fit of anger or reactionary, type attitude. Let's think about this and, how are we going to change it? Or you think about these statues and, maybe we do need to change Fort Bragg, because it's based upon a Confederate general. But, at what cost and what do we change it to? Let's not just do that spur of the moment, because you see that with the left today, is you can get to the point where all of a sudden now they're desecrating statues of Abraham Lincoln or Frederick Douglass. We get to a point where it's just this fit of anger that doesn't actually lead to the type of discussions that we need to have to improve race relations. So Burke can guide us in that with giving us the philosophy and the perspective.
I think it's an extremely important point. If you look at Burke on the French Revolution, a lot of his early concern and a lot of his deepest concern is about that kind of unleashing of extremism. He basically says, once you walk down the street with somebody's head on a pike, you're never going back to normal politics, even if that person deserved it. It's bad for society to get yourself to that place. And I think there's a lot of that to be said about our current moment where, I think there's a case for taking down some of these statues. Maybe we can talk about them individually and think about what are we for and what are we against? What do we believe in and who do we want to highlight? And maybe some people wouldn't meet that standard, but, most of them would. Abraham Lincoln would. Frederick Douglass would. Once we get ourselves to a place where we're just throwing away the past and tearing down statues for the sake of tearing down statues, then we lose our history. And when we lose our history, we lose our capacity for improvement. Yeah. And I think it's very important to see that we don't have all the answers now. It's not that we're at a place where we're ready to throw everything away and now we can move forward. We need our history in order to learn in an ongoing way.
Yeah, and my last question for you is, so we're obviously trying to do this as much as we can with our channel, but how do we kind of return to some of that Burkean perspective? How do we inject that more into conservatism? You talk about a hyper-individualism that's kind of taken over, I think, of the libertarian wing of the conservative movement. You talked about populism. That's certainly present today. How do we start to bring him back to the discussion, aside from the occasional Supreme Court justice, mentioning him? How do we actually make that thoughtful of our movement?
Yeah, I mean, some of that is, reading him and talking about him, but I think there's also, maybe in some ways, the most important thing he can provide for us is a sense of humility. And that points us, on the one hand, away from radical individualism, from the sense that I have everything I need and you should just leave me alone. We all need society, we all need communities, we all need formation. And I think we as conservatives need to see that and acknowledge that. And that should move us in the direction of a kind of community cohesion and communitarianism, and not toward radical individualism. But at the same time, that means that there are no experts we can trust to govern us and not require us to be engaged as citizens. They don't know everything and we don't know everything. And that's why we need institutions that can help us get the best of both, that can be representative but also channel some expertise and knowledge. And that's how our Constitution functions. So it seems to me that in today's America, Burkeanism can meld into a kind of constitutionalism and can help us understand the benefits of the institutions we've inherited and how they can play into human nature in ways that mitigate our weaknesses, that reinforce our strengths. That kind of humility, to me, is what conservatism is all about, and I do think we need to recover it.
Yeah, no, that's a very eloquent answer. One of our board members wanted me to ask that question, and my response was, well, buy his book. Like, start with
You should do that too.
It's a great one. So, no, thank you so much for your time with us. We really appreciate it. Love having you on, sir. So, thanks again for your time, and we look forward to having you again someday. Thanks.
I appreciate it.